The unforgivable act. The space station called Concord Apex floated between stars like a silver crown, a meeting place for 7 great civilizations of the galaxy, built so that wars would stay in the past and trade would take their place instead. It was a place of long tables and long speeches, of diplomats in expensive clothes who smiled at each other while hiding knives behind their backs. Every species had a seat at those tables. Every species had a voice. Humanity's seat was a small one. The other civilizations did not think much of humans. They were a young species, barely 200 years into space travel, and they were small and soft and had only a handful of colony worlds to their name. The Vrethkai Empire found humans amusing, the way a grown soldier might find a child swinging a stick amusing. The Thalsarin, old and powerful and wise beyond most living memory, simply ignored them. The other species barely remembered to include humanity in their meeting schedules at all. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had sat in that small seat for 6 years. She had learned to smile when they ignored her and to speak clearly when they talked over her. She had learned the names of every delegate, every aide, every guard, and every cook on that station. She had learned patience the way a mountain learns patience, not by trying, but by simply enduring everything that was thrown at it. On the morning everything changed, she was drinking coffee and reading reports when her communications officer knocked on her office door and opened it without waiting for an answer. She looked up from her desk. His face was the color of old ash. He placed a data tablet on her desk and stepped back. She picked it up and read. She did not make a sound. She did not move for a long time. The coffee went cold beside her hand and she did not notice. New Meridian was the 4th human colony world. It was not a military planet. There were no warships based there, no weapons factories, no soldier training camps. It was a farming world mostly. Long flat fields of yellow grain under a warm sun, small towns connected by dirt roads, rivers full of silver fish. 40,000 families had built their lives there over the past 30 years. Children went to school in the mornings and came home in the afternoons with mud on their boots and stories about what they had found in the fields. The Vrethkai had chosen it for exactly that reason. War Patriarch Gorzal had led his fleet of 300 warships into the New Meridian system 6 hours ago. He had not issued a warning. He had not demanded surrender. He had simply opened fire on the settlements below, the schools first, then the shelters, then the hospitals where the sick and the very young were kept. His ships had swept across the planet 3 times, making sure nothing was missed. 40,000 children were dead. The stated reason, released in an official Vrethkai declaration to the Galactic Conclave, was a trade boundary dispute. A line on a map that humanity had allegedly crossed by establishing a farming outpost 4 light years from the agreed border. The declaration used the phrase disciplinary correction to describe what had happened on New Meridian. Gorzal himself, in a recorded message to his fleet commanders, had called it pruning the herd before it grows dangerous. The Conclave had received this declaration 2 hours ago. They had already drafted a response, a formal letter of condemnation, worded carefully so as not to offend the Vrethkai too greatly, recommending a committee be formed to review the border dispute. A committee. Elena Vasquez read the Conclave's draft response after she finished reading the attack report. She put the tablet down on her desk and sat very still for another long moment. Then she looked at her communications officer and told him to leave the room and close the door. He left quickly. She opened her personal communication terminal, the one that used the encrypted channel that bypassed the Conclave's monitoring systems entirely, the one that had been installed on the day she took this posting and had never been used. She had hoped it would never need to be used. She had hoped that humanity would be left alone long enough to grow strong in peace. Hope had not survived the morning. She entered a code she had memorized on her first day as ambassador, a code that had been passed down through every human ambassador for the past 40 years like a family secret, No one wanted to exist. Then she typed a message of 12 words into the terminal. Authorization, Shepherd's Wrath, all codes confirmed. New Meridian, 40,000 children, send everyone. She sent it. Then she walked out of her office and back into the main hall of the conclave floor, where the other ambassadors were gathered in small groups talking quietly about the situation. The Vrethkai ambassador, a tall reptilian creature named Sezrak, was standing near the center of the room accepting polite expressions of concern with a patient expression that barely hid his amusement. He caught Alina's eye from across the room. He smiled at her, a wide, tooth-heavy smile that his species used when they wanted to signal dominance. She looked at him without expression for 3 full seconds. Then she turned away and walked to her seat at the small table in the corner of the hall. Sezrak watched her and chuckled quietly to his aide. "They will write a strongly worded letter," he said in Vrethkai, "perhaps 2, and then they will return to growing grain." His aide agreed. Neither of them noticed that Alina Vasquez had not touched the conclave's draft condemnation letter that sat waiting on the table in front of her. She had not reviewed it, had not added Human's name to the list of signatures, had not made a single comment. She simply sat with her hands flat on the table and waited, the way a stone waits at the top of a hill. Back on New Meridian, rescue workers were still pulling bodies from the rubble of collapsed school buildings. They wore breathing masks because the air was thick with smoke. They worked in silence because there was nothing to say. One rescue worker, a man named Darren who had moved to New Meridian 20 years ago to raise his 3 daughters, found a classroom that had not fully collapsed. The roof had come down at an angle, leaving a small pocket of space near the back wall. The students had moved to the back when the attack began. There were 14 of them, between the ages of 7 and 10, sitting in a tight group against the wall with their arms around each other. None of them had survived. Darren sat down on a broken piece of wall outside the building and could not stand back up for a long time. In the dark quiet of deep space, far from any star's light, something began to move. It had been still for a very long time, years in some cases. Ships that had never appeared on any conclave registry, built in the outer systems where no one was watching, crewed by men and women who had signed their names to a mission they hoped they would never have to fly. 6,000 warships, the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled, began to power their engines for the first time in years. They had been given one set of orders, written 40 years ago by a war council that had looked at humanity's history. At every massacre, every genocide, every moment when a powerful nation had destroyed a weaker one's children, and decided that if it ever happened to them, there would be no negotiation, no committee, no letter of condemnation. There would only be response. The Vrethkai Empire had 14 star systems, 30 billion souls, 4,000 warships, and a war patriarch who had smiled at a human ambassador that morning. The orders were already in motion. The galaxy did not know yet what it had allowed to happen. It would learn soon enough. What humans remember. The War Council chamber beneath the city of Geneva was not a beautiful room. It had no windows, no decoration, no artwork on the walls. It had a long table made of dark wood, 22 chairs, bright overhead lights, and a large screen on the far wall that was currently showing a map of Vrethkai space. That was all it needed to be. Admiral Kira Amandi sat at the head of the table. She was 63 years old, with short white hair and hands that had developed a faint tremor in the last 2 years that she refused to let anyone notice. She had commanded 7 military operations during her career, none of them large enough to matter to the galaxy's powerful civilizations, but all of them decisive enough to matter to the people who had needed saving. She had retired 8 months ago. She had been gardening when the message came. She had not changed her clothes before driving to Geneva. She was still wearing the old faded shirt she had been wearing when she knelt in the dirt beside her tomato plants. No one said anything about the shirt. The room was full. Every seat taken, plus people standing along the walls, generals, intelligence chiefs, fleet commanders, the Secretary of Earth, 2 members of the Science Council. They had all arrived within 3 hours of the authorization code being sent. That was how it worked. When the Shepherd's Wrath protocol activated, everyone on the list came immediately, no questions asked, no delays permitted. Admiral Amandi looked at the map on the wall for a while without speaking. The Vrethkai Empire glowed in red 14 systems, spread across a wide region of space, 3 weeks of FTL travel from human territory. She studied the positions of their known fleet stations, their supply lines, their patrol routes. Intelligence had been gathering this information for 40 years. Every update filed, every shift in patrol schedules noted, every new warship that rolled out of a Vrethkai construction yard added to the record. Humanity had been watching them for a very long time. She turned to the room and asked a single question: "Where is the fleet?" The answer came from a young fleet coordinator named Priya Nair, standing at a secondary console along the wall. "All 6,000 ships are active and moving, Admiral. Formation will be complete in 18 hours. We are ready to jump on your order." Kira nodded. She had expected this. The fleet had been kept in constant low-power readiness for years. The crews rotated in shifts of 6 months so that there were always experienced hands aboard every ship. The supplies were maintained on a rolling schedule. 6,000 warships, crewed and ready and waiting, hidden in the dark space between human systems where no one had ever thought to look. Because no one had ever thought humanity worth looking at carefully. The Secretary of Earth, a tall, thin man named Johansson, leaned forward in his chair. He was not a military man, and he looked like someone who had not slept. "Admiral, I want to be clear about what we are authorizing here. This is not a punitive strike. This is not a show of force to bring the Vrethkai to a negotiating table. The protocol." "The protocol is clear," Kira said quietly. "I have read it. Everyone in this room has read it." 40,000 children, Johansson said. He said it the way a person says words that they cannot quite believe are real. 40,007, Priya said from the wall console. Her voice was flat. "The latest count from New Meridian." The room was silent. Kira looked at the secretary. The Shepherd's Wrath doctrine was not written carelessly. It was written by people who had studied every civilization in this galaxy that had been destroyed, every species that had been reduced to a handful of survivors on a prison world, while the species that destroyed them went on building empires. Every time, the story was the same. The strong nation struck the weak nation's children because they knew it would not cost them anything, because they knew the weak nation had no answer. She paused. "We wrote an answer. It took 40 years and cost more credits than I can name from memory, but we wrote it. And now the Vrethkai have given us the exact circumstances under which we use it." No one spoke against her. The vote, if it could be called a vote, since the doctrine technically did not require one, was unanimous. The order went out to Fleet Admiral Hassan Yilmaz aboard the command ship Unbroken Meridian Asterisk at the head of the Shepherd's Wrath fleet. Proceed to Vrethkai space. What the galaxy did not understand about humanity, what no species had bothered to study carefully enough to understand, was that humans had an unusually long memory for violence done to them. Other species grieved, recovered, and moved forward. Humans grieved, recovered, moved forward, and then quietly built systems to ensure it never happened again, systems they maintained for generations, systems they funded even when the threat seemed distant and theoretical, because they had learned from their own history that threats had a way of becoming real at the worst possible moment. The Vrethkai had assumed humanity was the same as every other young species they had encountered, impressed by shows of force, eager to avoid conflict, quick to find a diplomatic exit from a bad situation. And for most situations, that was accurate. Humans were not looking for war. They had never been looking for war. They had built the Shepherd's Wrath fleet precisely so that they would never need to look for it. Because if someone crossed the single line that could never be crossed, the response would be so total and so swift that no cost-benefit analysis in any War Council chamber anywhere would ever recommend it. War Patriarch Gorzal had not done a cost-benefit analysis. He had looked at a map of human colony worlds and seen soft targets. Fleet Admiral Yilmaz stood on the bridge of the Unbroken Meridian and watched his navigation display fill with the blue markers of ships forming up around him. 6,000 blue markers. His crew was quiet around him, professional, focused, each of them thinking about the same thing but not saying it, because there was nothing useful to say. They all had younger brothers, sisters, cousins. They all knew what a school building looked like. "Fleet is formed, Admiral," his navigation officer reported. Yilmaz looked at the route plotted on the main screen. 17 jumps. The fastest path to the edge of Vrethkai space that would avoid detection for as long as possible. "Set course," he said. "All ships maximum FTL speed." 6,000 ships jumped simultaneously. In their wake, the space where they had been waiting was completely empty, as if they had never existed at all. Back on conquered Apex, the Vrethkai ambassador Sezrak was hosting a small dinner party in his private quarters for 3 allied ambassadors. The food was excellent. The conversation was light. Someone made a joke about the human ambassador's expression that morning, and everyone at the table laughed. Elena Vasquez was not at her table in the conclave hall. She was in her office, reading casualty reports from New Meridian one by one. She read every name that had been recovered so far. There were still many that had not been recovered, still buried under rubble. She read every recovered name, and then she closed her eyes for a moment and opened them and read the next one. She did not sleep that night. She did not expect to sleep for quite some time. The galaxy watches in silence. The document arrived at the Galactic Conclave's official receiving desk at 600 station time, filed under the heading Formal Notice of Action, Human Sovereign Authority. It was 43 pages long. It was written in 12 galactic languages. It had been prepared, according to its filing date, 37 years ago, and updated annually ever since. The Conclave's head clerk, a Thalsarin elder named Osivan who had worked at that desk for 60 years, read the first 3 pages and then set it down, and contacted every senior ambassador on the station before breakfast. The document was not a declaration of war. It was something the Conclave had never received before, a notice of extinction-level retribution, a legal filing that formally notified the Conclave that humanity was undertaking a military operation against the Vrethkai Empire in direct response to the New Meridian massacre, that this operation would continue until all military objectives were complete, and that any species that chose to intervene on behalf of the Vrethkai would be considered a co-participant in the original action. It listed the legal basis. It listed the evidence. It listed the names of every child recovered from New Meridian's rubble, all 40,007 of them, printed in full, taking up 21 of the document's 43 pages. It was filed correctly, stamped correctly, signed by Ambassador Vasquez and countersigned by the full Earth War Council. Every procedural requirement met, every form filled in, every line legal and proper and on the official record. The Conclave emergency session was called within an hour. Vasquez walked into the main chamber and took her small seat and waited, while every other ambassador filed in with the particular expression people wear when they have just received news that rearranges everything they thought they understood about the world. The Vrethkai ambassador Sezrak arrived last, moving quickly, his neck frill flat against his back in a posture that his species used for stress. The session chair, a Mervathi delegate with 3 sets of arms, called the meeting to order and asked Vasquez directly if she was prepared to withdraw the notice and return to diplomatic channels. "No," Vasquez said. "Ambassador, the Conclave strongly urges." The Conclave had 40,007 opportunities to prevent this, Vasquez said. Her voice was calm and very clear. When the Vrethkai fleet entered New Meridian space, every long-range sensor network in the station registered it. When they opened fire on civilian settlements, the data was available in real time to every intelligence service represented in this room. No one contacted us. No one dispatched a mediation ship. No one sent so much as a message. The room was very quiet. The window for diplomacy closed with the last child they buried on New Meridian. I am here as a courtesy, so that no one can claim they were not informed. Cesrak stood up. His voice had a practiced quality. He had clearly prepared a speech. He spoke about the border dispute, about Vrethkai's sovereign rights, about humanity's obligation to accept the Conclave's authority, about the danger of unilateral military action, about the importance of the rules and frameworks that kept the galaxy stable. Vasquez let him finish. Then she looked at him and said, "Every word you just said is an attempt to make what happened on New Meridian sound like a misunderstanding that reasonable parties can discuss. It was not a misunderstanding. Your war patriarch murdered children on purpose, specifically because they were children, specifically because he believed it was safe to do so. We are here to demonstrate that it was not safe. We have no further business in this chamber today." She stood up and walked out. In Vrethkai space, the first border patrol spotted the human fleet approximately 9 minutes before it reached weapons range. The patrol commander had time to send one emergency burst transmission to the nearest Vrethkai fleet station. Unknown fleet massive, entering System 7, requesting. The transmission ended. The Vrethkai border fleet at Station 7 was 400 warships, a number that would have overwhelmed any human military force the galaxy had ever seen. They had good weapons, experienced crews, and 3 decades of combat experience fighting various smaller species along their border. They lasted 4 hours. Not because they fought poorly. They fought the way the Vrethkai always fought, aggressively, without retreating, throwing everything they had at the enemy in a direct frontal assault that had broken dozens of opposing fleets over their history. But the human fleet did not fight the way any fleet they had ever faced fought. The humans moved in complex coordinated patterns that their tactical AI generated and updated in real time, each ship adjusting to the positions of every other ship every 3 seconds. The Vrethkai could not fix a target that was always moving. The humans could. The second border fleet at Stations 8 and 9 heard what had happened at Station 7 and assembled a combined force of 600 ships. They set up a defensive formation along the inner approach, a wall of firepower that should have been impossible to break without massive losses. The human fleet sent 300 ships to engage them directly and 200 ships around the system's outer edge at a speed the Vrethkai had not calculated as possible. The flanking force came in from above the formation's blind spot. The engagement lasted 6 hours. When it ended, there were no Vrethkai ships remaining. Human casualties: 11 ships destroyed, 23 damaged, against 900 Vrethkai warships. This information was not announced by humanity. They sent no press releases, no victory declarations, no messages to the Conclave. They simply kept moving inward, the blue wave of 6,000 ships advancing system by system, methodical and unstoppable. But every species had sensor networks. Every intelligence service in the galaxy was watching. The Thalsarin Senior Council convened in emergency session. The eldest member of the council, a being who had lived for 400 years and had seen 20 wars begin and end, reviewed the battle data 3 times. She looked at the human fleet's movement patterns and the casualty numbers and the rate of advance, and then she asked her military advisors a direct question. Have they reached their full capability yet? The answer, after considerable analysis, was, "We do not believe so, Elder." The room went very quiet. On Conquered Apex, alien ambassadors were gathering in small groups in corridors and private rooms, speaking in low voices. None of them had expected this. They had all, without quite saying it aloud to each other, assumed that humanity's response to New Meridian would be grief, then letters, then a long, boring process of diplomatic demands and partial compensation. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked when a strong empire struck a weak species people. The weak species filed complaints. The strong empire paid a fine eventually. Life continued. Instead, the galaxy's monitoring systems were showing 6,000 human warships erasing the Vrethkai border defenses as if they were practice targets. Instead, those 43 pages with 40,007 names on them were sitting in the Conclave's official record, completely unanswerable, legally clean, morally direct. Ambassador Cesrak stopped taking meetings. He was locked in his quarters sending frantic transmissions to Vreth Prime, demanding guidance, demanding that the War Council respond, demanding that someone tell him what to do. The transmissions that came back were increasingly short and increasingly frightened. On New Meridian, Darren still went to work every morning with the rescue teams. They had cleared most of the rubble now, and the work had shifted to the quieter task of identification and record. He carried a notebook in his breast pocket where he wrote down every name as it was confirmed. He did not know why he was writing them down. The officials were recording everything on proper data systems. He just needed to write them down himself, with his own hand, so that he had held the names somehow. He had filled 41 pages of the notebook. He had bought a second notebook. In the deep dark of Vrethkai space, a war patriarch sat in his throne room and looked at reports that could not be real, and knew with the cold certainty of a man who had spent his whole life making war that they were very real indeed. Gorzal's last gambit. The throne room on Vreth Prime was built to intimidate. The ceiling was 30 meters high. The walls were covered in the skulls of enemies the Vrethkai Empire had defeated over the past 3 centuries, each one mounted and labeled with the species' name and date of conquest. The floor was polished black stone that reflected everything above it like a dark mirror. War Patriarch Gorzal had held court in this room for 22 years and had never once felt small inside it. He felt small now. 6 of his 14 systems were gone. Not occupied, gone asterisk, in the sense that every military installation in them had been dismantled or destroyed, every fleet asset eliminated, every command structure removed. The human fleet moved through his space the way fire moves through dry paper, not fast in a dramatic sense, but steady and total and leaving nothing behind it. His war council sat around the long table at the base of his throne dais. Most of them had stopped making eye contact with each other. The fleet commanders who were still alive had sent reports that ranged from grim to incoherent. One commander had simply sent the word retreat 14 times in a row before his ship's signal had disappeared from the communication network. Gorzal was not a man who panicked. He was a man who had survived 40 years of Vrethkai politics, which was arguably more dangerous than any war, and he had done it by thinking clearly when everyone else was falling apart. He was thinking clearly now. He simply did not like what his clear thinking was producing. He had 4 options. He intended to try all of them. The first was reparations. He drafted a formal offer personally, a massive financial payment to humanity, an official acknowledgement that the New Meridian action had been poorly calibrated, a border agreement that gave humanity everything they had ever asked for and more. He transmitted it through the Conclave's official channels and through 3 separate back channels that his diplomats maintained for exactly this kind of situation. Humanity's response came back in 40 minutes. It was a single sentence, signed by Ambassador Vasquez. The Conclave has been informed that no communication of this nature will receive a reply. His second option was leverage. He had 18 human nationals on Vreth Prime, academics, trade representatives, 2 journalists, who had been on the planet when the war began and had since been moved to a secure facility outside the capital. They were not being harmed. He made sure they were not being harmed because he understood that harming them would make his situation worse, and because he needed them as bargaining pieces, not as corpses. He announced through the conclave that he was prepared to release the human civilians in exchange for a ceasefire negotiation. The human fleet's advance did not pause by a single hour. Instead, 3 human warships detached from the main fleet and arrived at the edge of Vreth Prime's system with a single transmission, the coordinates of the facility where the civilians were being held, and a demand that they be transported to a neutral pickup point within 6 hours. The transmission made clear that if the civilians were not at the pickup point in 6 hours, the 3 warships would retrieve them personally, and that the Vrethkai military was strongly advised not to be in the way when that happened. The civilians were at the pickup point in 4 hours. The 3 human ships collected them and returned to the main fleet, which continued its advance without comment. Gorzal's third option was the Galactic Conclave itself. He requested an emergency conclave intervention, a formal order requiring humanity to halt its military operation pending a full review. He called in every political favor his empire had accumulated over decades of alliance building. He reminded the Mervathi of the trade agreements that benefited them. He reminded the Sethali collective of the 3 times Vrethkai warships had escorted their colony ships through pirate space. He made promises he had no intention of keeping to species he had always considered beneath him. Several of them were sympathetic, several of them drafted motions, several of them brought those motions to the conclave floor. Every single one of them quietly dropped their motions within 24 hours. The reason became clear when the Thalsarin senior ambassador made a rare public statement. She had contacted Fleet Admiral Yilmaz privately, she confirmed, and had expressed the Thalsarin's concern about the scale of the human operation. Fleet Admiral Yilmaz's response, she said, had been polite and brief. Humanity had no quarrel with the Thalsarin, and the Thalsarin were welcome to stay out of the way and they would have nothing to worry about. The implication was clear. The Thalsarin were the most powerful civilization in the galaxy. They had been offered a quiet exit and they had taken it. If the Thalsarin were stepping aside, no one else in the galaxy was going to step in front of 6,000 human warships. Gorzal's fourth option was a public appeal. He recorded a transmission and broadcast it on every open channel the conclave monitored, a dramatic, well-constructed speech about humanity's brutality, about the disproportionate nature of the response, about the danger that a species this violent and this willing to use overwhelming force posed to galactic civilization. He called on every species in the galaxy to form a defense coalition. He used the words common threat and shared future, and the rule of law that protects us all. He waited for responses. The galaxy responded with silence. Not confused silence, or uncertain silence, or the silence of species still making up their minds. It was the silence of beings who had read 43 pages with 40,007 children's names printed in them, who had watched the legal notice that was filed correctly and properly before a single shot was fired, who had looked at the battle data showing human ships taking casualties of less than 1% while eliminating forces 10 times their size, and who had collectively, quietly, without coordinating with each other, reached the same conclusion. There was nothing to be done here. Gorzal had done this to himself. The children of New Meridian were dead because of a decision he had made, and he had made that decision because he thought it was safe. He had been wrong, and the universe was not going to save him from being wrong. On Vreth Prime, the capital city began to empty. Not because anyone ordered evacuation. Gorzal had specifically not ordered evacuation, because an empty capital looked like defeat, and he was not ready to accept that word yet. People simply began leaving on their own, quietly in private vehicles and on foot, moving away from the city center toward the outer regions. The old ones and the very young went first, carried or guided by the adults of their families. There was no panic. Just a steady, wordless movement of people who understood what was coming better than their war patriarch did. In the secure military command center beneath the palace, Gorzal's remaining generals were running projections. Every scenario they ran produced the same outcome within different timeframes. The math did not change regardless of what assumptions they adjusted. The human fleet would reach Vreth Prime in 11 days if its current rate of advance held. One of the generals, an old female commander named Vrezeth who had served in 4 wars and was the only person in the room who would still speak plainly, put down her data tablet and looked at Gorzal directly. "Patriarch," she said, "the children of New Meridian were not soldiers. They were not threats. They were not combatants of any kind. Whatever the border dispute was about, targeting them was not a military decision. It was, and I say this as someone who has served you loyally for 15 years, it was a mistake of a kind that cannot be corrected." Gorzal looked at her for a long time. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I am suggesting," she said carefully, "that you consider what your options actually are at this point versus what you wish they were." He had no answer for that. Outside the palace windows, another column of civilian vehicles moved silently toward the city's edge, headlights cutting through the night, carrying families away from what was coming, families who had not ordered the attack on New Meridian, who had not made the speech about pruning herds, who had simply lived in the same empire as the man who had, and were now moving through the dark because of it. The human fleet was 11 days away, and it had not slowed down by a single hour. What the stars learned that day. Human ground forces landed on Vreth Prime on a Tuesday morning local time, under a pale orange sky. They did not land in the capital. They did not land near the palace. They came down in the open fields 15 kilometers outside the city in clean formation, and they set up a perimeter, and they waited. Fleet Admiral Yilmaz had transmitted a message to the Vrethkai Military Command 12 hours before landing. Any Vrethkai soldier who put down their weapon and stepped away from their post would not be harmed. Any Vrethkai soldier who did not would be handled accordingly. By the time the ground teams reached the capital's outskirts, the Vrethkai military had largely dissolved. Not in defeat, in exhaustion. Soldiers who had been fighting a losing war for 11 days against a fleet that did not stop, that did not make mistakes, that did not accept surrender of territory, and then pause to negotiate the way every other enemy they had ever fought did. Those soldiers had run out of the particular kind of energy required to keep fighting when winning is impossible. Most of them simply sat down. Some of them helped their families move further out of the city when they heard the landing ships coming. The human ground teams moved through the capital in careful formation, block by block, with their weapons ready but not firing. They were looking for specific people. They had a list. Gorzal was found in his throne room. He had not run. He was sitting on his throne in full formal armor, the skull-covered walls behind him, the black floor reflecting the overhead lights in a dark mirror below his feet. He had clearly intended to make this moment look a certain way, the defiant patriarch, dignified in defeat, waiting for the conquerors to come to him. The human team leader who entered the room was a young captain named Solano, who was 29 years old and had grown up in a city on New Meridian's neighbor world. She had known people on New Meridian. She had attended memorial services in the weeks before deploying. She looked at Gorzal on his throne and at the skulls on his walls and said nothing for a moment. Then she told him, in a voice that was completely level, that he was under arrest for war crimes under human military law and would be transported to a neutral facility for formal trial proceedings. She told him that he would be treated properly throughout. She told him that his legal rights as a defendant would be respected in full. Gorzal stared at her. He had prepared several speeches. None of them seemed applicable. He went without resistance. The other 31 officers who had signed the orders for New Meridian were collected from various locations across Vreth Prime over the next 48 hours. None of them fought. Most of them had been sitting in their homes. Vrezeth, the old general who had spoken plainly to Gorzal in the command bunker, was found at her family's residence in the outer city. She came to the door before the team could knock and stood in the doorway and looked at them. She asked if she was on the list. The team leader confirmed that she was not. She nodded slowly. She asked what would happen to the Vrethkai people. The team leader told her that the human fleet's orders regarding civilian populations were strict. No harm to civilians, no destruction of civilian infrastructure, no interference with basic services. The Vrethkai Empire's military capacity would be reduced to zero, and its political leadership structure would be placed under conclave supervision. But the people of Vreth Prime and the other systems would be able to continue their lives. Vrezeth stood in her doorway for a long moment. Then she went inside and closed the door. The tribunal was held 3 weeks later on Conquered Apex. It was broadcast live on every open channel the Conclave operated, at humanity's specific request. Not to humiliate, the human legal team had been very deliberate in framing this point, but because the record had to exist in a form that everyone in the galaxy could access and review. Because the children of New Meridian deserved to be the center of a public accounting, not a closed-door settlement that could be reduced to a footnote in a decade. The chamber was full. Every ambassador, every journalist, every diplomat who could find a seat was present. The ones who could not find seats watched on screens throughout the station. The human legal team presented their case in order. The evidence of the attack, the chain of command, the signed orders, the recorded transmissions in which Gorzal and his commanders discussed their intentions, and then the 21 pages of names. The 21 pages of names were read aloud by a single reader, a young woman from New Meridian named Asha who had been 8 years old when the attack happened and had survived because she had been home sick that day. She stood at the reader's podium and read every name in a clear voice with no pause and no break from the first name to the last. It took 4 hours and 20 minutes. The chamber was completely silent throughout except for her voice. When she finished, she thanked the chamber for its time and sat down. Gorzal was allowed to speak before the verdict. He had prepared something. He delivered part of it about sovereignty, about borders, about the nature of power in the galaxy, but somewhere in the middle of his speech, looking at the chamber full of faces watching him with an expression he did not have a word for, he stopped. He stood in silence for a moment. Then he looked at Alina Vasquez, who was sitting in the front row. "How did you do this?" he asked. He was not performing anymore. He was genuinely asking. "You were nothing, a footnote, a young species with a handful of worlds and small ships. How did you build this without anyone knowing?" Vasquez looked at him calmly. "We are the species that invented the word consequence," she said. "We have been teaching it to ourselves for 10,000 years. We simply never had to teach it to someone else before." The verdict was read. Gorzal and the 31 officers received life sentences to be served in a facility jointly administered by the Conclave and human authorities. They would have proper food, proper medical care, and no cruelty. That had been another specific requirement of the human legal team. No cruelty, full documentation, everything on the record. Because the point was not to be what Gorzal was. On New Meridian, Admiral Kira Amandi attended the dedication of the Children's Memorial in her full-dress uniform. She had flown out from Geneva the night before, and she had not slept on the flight. She stood at the base of the memorial, a wide wall of white stone that curved gently in a half-circle, covered from one end to the other with names carved at eye level, each letter cut deep and clean into the surface. And she looked at the names for a long time without speaking. The family stood around her in the warm light of the colony world sun. Darren stood near the left edge of the wall with his notebook in his hand. He had filled 4 of them by now. He looked at the stone and found the section where the names he had recorded in his own handwriting matched the names carved in front of him, and something in his chest moved in a way that was neither relief nor grief exactly, but something that contained both. Kira placed her hand flat against the stone and stayed like that for a minute. Then she stepped back and stood at attention and was still. No speeches were given. Someone had suggested speeches, and the families of New Meridian had declined. There was nothing to say that the wall did not already say better. On Concord Apex, head clerk Asivan went back to his desk after the tribunal broadcast ended and opened Humanity's official file in the Conclave archive. The file he had been maintaining and updating for 20 years, the file that described Humanity's status, threat level, military capability, and diplomatic standing within the galactic community. He had updated it many times, minor adjustments mostly. Observer status changes, colony world additions, trade agreement references. He opened the threat assessment field. It currently read, non-threatening, limited military capability, recommends standard observer engagement protocols. He deleted the entire entry. He sat for a moment with the cursor in the blank field. Then he typed a single word. Warning. He saved the file and closed it and went to make tea. In the quiet of a research office 2 halls away from his desk, a young Mervathi academic named Threx who studied emerging species pulled up Humanity's updated file and read it 3 times. She had spent 2 years writing a preliminary paper arguing that humanity was unlikely to develop meaningful galactic influence within the next century. She had cited their small fleet, their few colonies, their apparent eagerness to avoid conflict. She opened a new document and started a different paper. She titled it, What We Missed, a Study in Systematic Underestimation. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy did not talk about humanity the way it had before. Not with contempt, and not with the particular kind of dismissal that had passed for acknowledgement before. The new conversations were quieter and more careful. Species that had never thought much about humans began thinking about them, began reviewing what they knew and what they had assumed, began comparing what they had thought humanity was capable of versus what humanity had just demonstrated. The answer to that comparison was not comfortable. Humanity, for their part, said very little. They dismantled the Vrethkai military infrastructure on the agreed schedule. They handed supervision of the Vrethkai systems to the Conclave as promised. They brought their fleet home, not all of it, not in the specific same form it had deployed in, but the bulk of it, back to the hidden stations in the outer systems where it had waited before. It kept waiting. Ambassador Vasquez returned to her small seat at the conclave table. The table did not feel as small as it used to. Or perhaps it was the same size it had always been, and the people around it had simply started paying attention to who was sitting there. She asked for her coffee and read her reports and waited for the next session to begin. The stars outside the station's viewports looked the same as they always had, old and bright and indifferent. But somewhere between them, in the long, quiet distances of deep space, the galaxy was doing something it had never done before where humans were concerned. It was being careful.